Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll be reading The History of Slave Breeding, The American Slave Coast by Ned and Constance Subletti. We're going to finish the book tonight, so it's going to be a long one. So sit back, relax, and listen up. We're on chapter 45, which starts on page 634. The chapter is called The Decommissioning of Human Capital, or How Do We Get Rid of All This Black Labor We Got Now That We Have No Use for It? It starts with two quotes. The first one is a representative from Massachusetts named Samuel Hooper. He was arguing in favor of the Legal Tender Act dated February 3rd, 1862, so the height of the Civil War. Every intelligent man knows that coined money is not the currency of the country. That's because the enslaved people were. Then there was another quote here from an unidentified informant at Fisk University, 1929 to 1930, which says, after the Civil War was over, old Massa brought some money in a bag and says to his wife that it wasn't no count. What was it they called it? Confederate money? You know, when the war ceased, money changed. Greenbacks. Yes'm. The federal government cost $1 million a day, maybe more, to run. There was nothing to run it with. Lincoln did not merely inherit a ransacked treasury and a government in debt from James Buchanan and Howell Cobb. He inherited more than 30 years of Jacksonian hobbles on the financial powers of federal government. In the years since Jackson had first become president, the United States had become an industrial and financial power fueled by earnings from the massive export of cotton. But its enormous economic growth had not been matched by an increase in federal resources, so they weren't taxing them. They were limited by a welter of archaic constraints, Brahaman writes. To keep relations between the government and the economy pure and wholesome, tons of gold had to be hauled to and fro in dray loads with horses and heavers doing by the hour what bookkeepers could do in a moment. This, moreover, was not the procedure of a backward people who knew nothing better. It was an obvious anachronism to which it kept tied around the federal government's neck. A mystical virtue was imputed. Actually, its only beneficiaries were the handlers of gold and spectators in it. So basically, they wanted to do things the old fashioned way because they didn't want the federal government to know how much money was really being moved and how much value was really there. Greetings, Forecast. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. There had been no national currency since before the Panic of 1837. The nation's finances had taken the Jeffersonian small government path instead of the Hamiltonian strong government system of managed debt and had ended up plucked clean. State power had been exalted and federal power demeaned, and the federal government had come apart. Cobb and Buchanan's systematic wasting of the Treasury had left the Jeffersonian Jacksonian tradition bankrupt. The way was clear for the remaking of a government along a Hamilton path or even possibly a Franklinian path, since it necessarily entailed paper money and lots of it. With the slavery interests, which had been the hard core of resistance to a strong federal government, having decamped, Lincoln now asserted federal powers in a way that had never been politically possible. In a desperate effort to fund the government's short term obligations as it went to war, Treasury Secretary Salmon P. Chase, a lawyer who was not a banker and was a hard money man, reluctantly issued U.S. Treasury notes. These quickly became known as greenbacks, and they were the first federally issued paper money. Greenbacks were not redeemable for gold or silver. They were what some economists call fiat money, money that was worth something because the government says it is, like the money we have today. Conceived by Elbridge G. Spaulding, the congressman from Buffalo, New York, who introduced the Legal Tender Act, greenbacks were a radical experiment born of the desperation Buchanan had left behind. Bray Hammond suggests that they were in effect a bankruptcy settlement. Though not convertible to specie, they were legal tender, meaning that their acceptance was mandatory for all obligations of the federal government. So they were forcing them to take this money. Gold was coming in from California, where it was being found in creeks and rocks. Gold was coming in from England, which had become dependent on the U.S. wheat after its own crops failed again. The federal government took in gold and paid out greenbacks, which carried no interest and bore no date of maturity. They were simply intended to pass from one hand to another and never be redeemed, only replaced. There was a model for the Legal Tender Act. New York's Free Banking Act of 1838, which dealt out money to the state's banks based on the amount of state bonds the bank had purchased and placed on deposit with the state. It was a hard fight to approve the act in Congress. After years of hard money, fiscal orthodoxy had taught that paper money was a diabolical swindle. Many believed that, as Jackson had insisted, the Constitution forbade such a thing. Lincoln signed the Legal Tender Act on February 25th, 1862, and the first notes went into circulation on April 5th, after the government had gone a long 3 months without money. 150 million were printed, though 60 million replaced demand notes without being withdrawn from circulation, leaving a net of 90 million of new money. 2 months later, Chase asked for and received another $150 million. So they are not new to printing money to meet their needs. They do it all the time. The obverse was a silver gray and the reverse was all green, giving the new paper dollar its nickname. Chase put his picture on the $1 bill and Lincoln's on the 10. There was, however, still a gold dollar in existence, so there were effectively two standards. The value for gold went up compared to the value of paper when the South won a victory, and down when the North won. The notes began depreciating, and after another $150 million worth of paper money was printed, in the aftermath of Lincoln's call for 300,000 more troops, they depreciated even more. The banks had wanted the Legal Tender Act, and it was followed by the National Bank Act of 1863, which created a national banking system. That year, Chase's supporter, John Thompson, founded First National, the bank that subsequently became Citibank. The banks took the greenbacks from the government and they paid them out to customers. At least they had something to use for money. Greenbacks were popular. People wanted paper money. Everyone was heartily sick of the patchwork system that privatized money issued by local banks, which was increasingly becoming irredeemable as the crisis of the war deepened. Many newspapers wanted paper money and evangelized on its behalf. Now, for the first time since Jackson killed the second bank of the United States, there was a paper money that had the same value everywhere in the country. The new federal notes had the effect of knitting together the roughly two-thirds of the country's population who were still flying the United States flag because everyone had a stake in the survival of the currency, which meant the survival of the Union. And that's why I put on my page, on my community post, the difference between an abolitionist and a unionist. They didn't care about slavery, they cared about upholding that US dollar. We're almost at that point today, in today's day and age, because other countries are saying we're going to trade in our dollars, not in US dollars, which is going to devalue the dollar, and we're going to feel the economic hurt of that. So we'll see how this government in modern times responds to it. The bills depreciated substantially but did not become valueless. By 1863, they were trading at 61% of their face value. Not bad considering the convulsions that the economy had undergone in wartime and the unresolved problems of dual gold and greenback systems. There were only 3 issues of greenbacks, which were withdrawn from circulation at the war's end, but the changeover had happened. Though the course was not so smooth, from then on the United States was committed to having a national paper currency. So it was the end of our enslavement that brought about the paper currency system that we have in place today. Greenbacks were as much an assertion of federal power as they were an economic innovation. Unlike the Confederate States of America, the United States had a functional government. As the Union created itself as a war machine, more initiatives issued from the federal government. Congress authorized and Lincoln signed an income tax. The Treasury sold the banks large amounts of long-term bonds. The Homestead Act was put into place, something that the South had been strenuously opposed to, but that now could pass in the absence of their obstruction to it, though free Black people were still excluded. The Land Grant Act apportioned land to public colleges across the country. The National Bankruptcy Act was implemented. The Yosemite Wilderness was set aside as a national park, and spectacular new possibilities were opened up for the corruption as vast amounts of Western land were granted to railroads, ushering in the new age of tycoons. Greetings, Anthony McPhail. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. We will not attempt to replay the great conflict in these pages. For our purposes, we think of it as two successive overlapping wars. The first we would call the War of Southern Conquest, which was started in the expectation of a quick takeover of the U.S. government by force. They still feel that way to this very day. That's what January 6th was about. They thought they could go in there and physically overwhelm the government and that the institutions would not hold. Its advance was quickly stopped, and it was definitively over by the time of the double Confederate losses at Gettysburg on July 3rd, 1863, which ended the South's invasion of the North, and Vicksburg, The next day, July 4th, 1863, which ended the South's control of the Mississippi River. Southern leadership, Jefferson Davis in particular, had no plan B. And it seemed as though they wanted to prolong the misery as long as possible. Having committed to the total war that treason was against the Republic signified, expecting to pay the maximum penalty in the case of a Northern victory without a negotiated settlement, they dug in and continued fighting a much larger, better equipped enemy as the corpses mounted up. But they still had their slaves, and property rights in human beings still had multiple benefits, one of which was allowing the owners to avoid combat. After the Confederate Congress passed the first Conscription Act in April of 1862, providing for 3 years of compulsory service, though one could hire a substitute, it passed on October 11th. It was the so-called 20 nigger law, which exempted from the draft one white man per plantation with 20 or more slaves in order to guard against rebellion. Overseers were also granted this exemption. It stimulated a wave of desertions already ongoing by the poor whites of the South, who were overwhelmingly the ones dying on the battlefields in support of slavery. A catchphrase was popularized that has persisted in subsequent conflicts: rich man's war, poor man's fight. The Confederate regime acted very much like an occupier on its own territory, especially on those rugged pockets with fewer slaves and consequently less interest in defending slavery. To fund its military operations, it imposed tax in kind, giving Army officers the authority to take anything they wanted in a government sanctioned banditry. Everything from the horse that pulled the wagon to the ham in the smokehouse and the corn in the garden plot, to the cloth women had wove to make clothes for their children. By 1862, already in Davis's Mississippi, crops were not being planted for lack of manpower and supplies. Young men were conscripted on pain of death into the Confederate Army, where they were miserably treated. Unlike their officer class, Confederate troops frequently went without uniforms, tents, shoes, or food, even in the war's early days, though they were well supplied with ammunition. So they gave a bunch of hungry, starving, naked, barely naked men guns and said, "Go fight our war." Nor did it escape notice that their many planters were occupying themselves not with fighting so much as with blockade running their cotton to market. What then united the South's poor yeomanry with its wealthy elite? Why did perhaps as many as 1 million Confederate soldiers experience untold misery and mass death to fight for the rights of 347,525 slave owners? Well, one dependable long term force that held the white class together was the culture of Negrophobia, the visceral fear of annihilation in the race war they were certain would follow emancipation. This deeply embedded, centuries old belief was subtly stoked at every turn. They have Negrophobia, and we believe that we have genetic superiority. Races have genetic equity, and white people have shown us time and time again that with genetic equity, our descendants unfortunately become whiter instead of blacker. So we have to keep that in mind. The War of Southern Conquest was from the beginning portrayed as the defense of white women and children against the conjectured mass violence of Black marauders, stoked against whites by the monstrous abolitionists. But there were also poor white yeoman farmers who regarded the Confederacy as a plague on them. There were Union volunteers from every slave state, and even in hardcore Mississippi, Jones County announced its independence from the Confederacy because slavery no longer served them because they had extracted all of the wealth they could out of these enslaved people. You got to remember that by this point in time, they were industrializing. So it was the trains and it was other industries that were coming about. So they had extracted all the wealth they could. They were no longer primarily an agrarian society. So they didn't care about the enslaved people or upholding slavery anymore for some genteel way of life that only an elite few could participate in. African Americans were entirely on one side in this war. Well, that's not true because we have documented examples of African Americans who were actually on the side of the Confederates. We have them wearing Confederate uniforms. So this is their propaganda. You got to remember to dissect that. So as far as this author is concerned, they're saying that African Americans were entirely on one side in this war. It can be said that African American abolitionists were entirely on one side of this war. But at the outset of the hostilities, they weren't allowed to fight. U.S. law prohibited Black soldiers from enlisting in the Army, though they were already Black soldiers in the Navy, and Lincoln did not at first attempt to change it. So, African American volunteers were turned down. The war went badly for the North during this time. Despite the South's insistence that the Black Republicans would force abolition on them, Lincoln never proposed to end slavery in the Southern states. He had begun by insisting that it was not a war about slavery, but to preserve the Union. But on September 22nd of 1862, prodded by Seward and Chase, as the carnage dragged on, and as Frederick Douglass had been urging all along, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, followed by a definitive proclamation on January 1st of 1863. Now remember, it only applied to those enslaved in the ceded territories of Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, Kentucky, Missouri, and the District of Columbia, as well as some occupied territories, continued to have slavery while remaining in the Union, with New Jersey using the euphemism apprentices. But the Emancipation Proclamation transformed the meaning of war. Only after the North committed unambiguously to the emancipation could the war be decisively won. Anthony McPhail says weren't those Black soldiers forced into the Confederate Army or promised freedom? Yes, some of them were promised freedom. Some of them were forced to be body men for white slave owners, and a much smaller amount of them were actually willing participants in the Confederacy because they brought into the fear mongering of the abolitionists and what abolition meant. Who's going to take care of you? I take care of you. I do all these things for you. I make sure your needs are met. It was the fear of the unknown that also caused some enslaved people in the South to want to fight for the Confederacy. Lincoln was not previously claimed to be prosecuting a war on slavery, but now that was unquestionably what it was all about. This then was the second phase of the war, which we will call the War on Slavery. Artist Francis Bicknell Carpenter, who painted an image scene of Lincoln reading the proclamation to his cabinet, wrote that Lincoln told him, "I felt that we had reached the end of our rope on the plan of operations we have been pursuing, that we had about played our last card and must change our tactics or lose the game." Why had Lincoln not started out that way? Well, according to Carter, Lincoln told him that it is my conviction that had the proclamation been issued even 6 months earlier than it was, public sentiment would not have sustained it. Just so as to the subsequent action in reference to enlisting blacks in the border states, the step taken sooner could not, in my judgment, have been carried out. In short, there was no political will. Effective January 1st of 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation, which didn't free a single slave, in effect was something symbolic, since it did not apply to those still held in enslaved Union territories and mostly applied to areas that the Union did not control. But it was nevertheless marked a change in the purpose of the war. The fire eaters had long charged that the North was planning to impose abolition on them. And now, for the first time, it was a policy goal. And in allowing for the enlistment and arming of Black soldiers, the Emancipation Proclamation was not symbolic at all. But remember, them Northern soldiers, them abolitionists, them Unionists fighting for the Union of this country had things like the Devil's Punch Bowl, where they froze and starved several African Americans to death. Remember, they withheld resources from them African Americans that they held as war trophies because they didn't want to give them guns, shoes, clothes, or food. So even if you were able to liberate yourself and make it to a Union stronghold, there was no guarantee that you would be treated any more humane in the hands of the Union Army than you were in the hands of the Confederate Army. In allowing for the enlistment and arming of Black soldiers, the Emancipation Proclamation was not symbolic at all. "I further declare and make known," it read, "that such persons of suitable condition will be received into the armed service of the United States to garrison forts, positions, stations, and other places, and to man vessels of all sorts in said service." Lincoln's game changer came as a shock to the Confederates. What Patrick Henry warned against had finally happened. Enslavers' assets, the property whose value had governed every Southern political initiative since the colonial days, were no longer legally recognizable as such. In a long message to the Confederate Congress on January 12th, Confederate President Jefferson Davis, who was never president of a functional government, but was a commander in chief of a losing war, denounced the execrable measure by which several millions of human beings of an inferior race, peaceful and contented laborers in their sphere, are doomed to extermination, while at the same time are encouraged to a general assassination of their masters. Up to that point, The Confederate hierarchy had considered the possibility that a negotiated outcome to the war might yet result in a reunited nation on their terms. That that fantasy was no more. Slave owners' wealth had crumbled to dust. There would be no more securitizing Southern banks, collateralized slave holdings by Northern banks, nor would European lenders buy into enslaved assets that Washington had pronounced worthless. Lincoln had been the weak candidate. Britain, which had suffered bad harvests and needed northern wheat, was siding with the North, despite considerable Confederate sympathy in Lancashire. So remember, England, okay, wanted to be on the side of the Confederacy, but they needed to eat, and they were growing things in those northern states and what was considered the Unionist territory. And because eating was more important than the cotton that they were getting, they decided that they would eat, but they sympathized with the Confederates. Nor did France save the day for Jefferson Davis. For, as George Washington said, instead, with the United States otherwise occupied, France invaded Mexico in 1861. The Emancipation Proclamation decommissioned the capitalized womb. Labor was no longer capital. African American children were no longer born to be collateral. Their bodies were no longer a better monetary value than paper. The U.S. economy was no longer on the Negro standard. Not only were the slaves emancipated, so was American money. The Emancipation Proclamation and the coming of the greenback were concurrent and were intimately related. Once the enormous appraised value of the bodies and the reproductive potential of 4 million people was no longer carried on the books as assets, dwarfing other sectors of the economy on paper and generally distorting the economy. The financial revolution of a national paper money was finally able to happen. The end of the slave breeding industry was crucial to the remaking of American money. The Confederacy, meanwhile, was not receiving gold from California or from wheat sales in Britain. Instead, it took in its supporters' accumulated savings in gold and silver, and in return, it gave them some 70 varieties of engraved notes, many of them bearing pictures of slaves working. Some had a written promise on the notes to pay them back with interest once the war was over. These notes were not usable to pay import dues. Only specie and bond coupons were allowed for that. Among the many notes featuring the picture on this page, which shows two enslaved men working a garden, was a $100 Confederate note issued at Richmond on December 11th, 1862, whose hopeful legend promised an excellent rate of return, saying, 6 months after the ratification of the Treaty of Peace between the Confederate States and the United States of America, the Confederate States of America will pay to the bearer on demand $100 with interest at 2 cents per day. The backside of the bill was blank. The South's banks were forced to buy worthless Confederate bonds on pain of being labeled as treasonous to the Southern cause, so they effectively had their assets confiscated by the Confederacy. Unsurprisingly, the Southern banking system did not survive the war. With it, when the commercial network that had connected the South's slave driven finance with that of the rest of the country. There was still money to be made by the intrepid cotton industry. Cotton had become a cash market, attracting middlemen willing to take personal risk in pursuit of high profit. Despite the difficulty of shipping, the sky high prices at that cotton fetched encouraged farmers to keep planting cotton instead of food. After Joseph Ackland died at the Angola plantation in 1863, his widow, Adelcia, previously Isaac Franklin's widow, is said to have slipped into Louisiana from Tennessee to negotiate the illegal sale of 2,800 bales of cotton to an English merchant for an exorbitant sum of gold, said to be $750,000 or more, which she subsequently collected in person in London. Despite the worthlessness of Confederate money, some people made a profit with it. When New Orleans was occupied by the Union in 1862, Julius Weiss, a merchant in Natchez, managed to sell his firm's inventory of ready made clothing to Confederate soldiers for Confederate money, which was then nearly at par, he recalled. I took $15,000 of this money and bought a piece of property in Memphis, which I sold after the war for a like amount of greenbacks, still having faith in the ultimate success of the Confederacy. He then spent another $18,000 in Confederate money for a fine-looking mulatto to whom he took a fancy. After the Southern Rebellion began, the Lehman Brothers were well positioned, having a New York office, and after the Union occupied the factorage capital of New Orleans in 1862, they established an office there. They became blockade runners, exporting such cotton as they could sneak out of the South. Blockade runners have been much romanticized, with tales of how they brought in British made guns to the Confederates. But much of what the blockade runners brought back were luxury goods because some of the wealthy continued to make money. After the war began, Charlie Lamar became a blockade runner, slipping in and out of Charleston harbors on moonless nights in unlighted ships, painted the color of the water, passed what Isidor Straus counted one night as 21 blockading steamers. The Strausses, too, went into the blockade running business. After a local grand jury excoriated what it called the evil, unpatriotic conduct of the representatives of Jewish houses, they called them out here. Lazarus Strauss moved his family from Tall Bottom to Columbus, Georgia, the Confederacy's second most important industrial center after Richmond in 1863, when Confederate money was trading 5 cents to the dollar in gold. New Orleans Jewish community tightly connected with that of the Charleston community, and it was perhaps doubled in size in the years preceding the secession. So they wanted slavery because they were profiting from slavery. And they numbered about 4,000 in 1861. Its merchants were clustered in the area of Canal Street, the dividing line between the town's Anglo and Creole populations. It contributed the Confederacy's most brilliant legal mind, Judah P. Benjamin, a St. Croix born farmer and former sugar planter, former slave owner, and a cosmopolitan attorney. He had been the second Jewish U.S. Senator in 1852 and was the second cousin of the first Jewish senator, David Levy Yulee, though neither he nor Yulee were practicing Jews. So, what they're saying is that these people were ethnic Jews, not practicing Jews. They were just a different version of white folks. It shouldn't matter what kind of Jew they were. If they identify as that, then that's what they are. And they need to own what they did and stop asking Black people to come to their rescue. Right? Right. A key advisor of Jefferson Davis, he became the Attorney General of the Confederacy, then its Secretary of War, then its Secretary of Treasury. The role of Jewish merchants as financial intermediaries irritated General Ulysses S. Grant, who said, "The Jews seem to be a privileged class that can travel anywhere," he wrote to an Assistant Secretary of War, C.P. Wolcott, in 1862. Then and today, this complaint of privilege was a central tenet of anti immigration rhetoric with which Grant was unfortunately familiar, as his political background included a strong nativist or white nationalist streak, and he had, in the winter of 1854 to 1855, briefly joined a lodge of xenophobic Know Nothing movement out of Missouri. Grant's General Order Number 11 of December 17, 1862, ordered the expulsion within 24 hours of all Jews as a class from Kentucky, Tennessee, and Mississippi. It was an attempt to stop cotton smuggling, but what it meant was that Jews who lived in those states were expected to pick up and leave their homes overnight. Grant's order all too easily fell into the pattern of anti Jewish language, some of it casual and some of it very deeply believed, that fell on occasion from the lips and pens of anti slavery figures that included William Tecumseh Sherman, William Lloyd Garrison, Henry Wilson, John Quincy Adams, and Henry Adams. It was the culmination of a series of measures on November 10th that had included an instruction to railroad conductors not to accept Jewish passengers. General Order Number 11 had predictably demoralizing effect on the 7,000 or so Jewish soldiers in the Union Army, subjecting them to taunts from other soldiers and causing one Jewish officer named Captain Philip Traunstein of the 5th Ohio Cavalry to resign in protest. A Jewish protest to Lincoln quickly resulted in the rescission of the order on January 6, 1863, and Grant subsequently apologized for having issued it. So these apology tours that they send celebrities on is nothing new. It's how their community moves. Where they do something, you tell the truth about them, you try to get them out the paint, get them out the way, get them out the pocket, move them so that they're no longer an issue for you and your people. And then you go on an apology tour because you told the truth about who they really are. There were about 3,000 Jewish soldiers in the Confederate Army, most of whom were poor immigrants. Jewish merchants in the South, meanwhile, found themselves denounced in the Confederate Congress and on the receiving end of accusations from townspeople of disloyalty and extortion. The worse the war went for the South, the more vulnerable to scapegoating the Jewish people were. It is instructive to unpack the first words of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address again. 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation. Lincoln thus dated the Republic as beginning 87 years previously, not from the 1789 Constitution, but from the 1776, though the Declaration of Independence does not mention a new nation. In affirming that the 13 colonies were a nation in 1776 rather than a confederation of 13 states, Lincoln was providing a revisionist take on the Declaration. He then attempted to reclaim the words of Southern hero Thomas Jefferson, saying, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. With the abolition now at the last of the official post-emancipation proclamation, U.S. policy, Lincoln was repudiating Dred Scott's interpretation of Jefferson's all men, declaring that the inspirational words might at last include those who had not been conceived at liberty. At last, liberty no longer meant liberty for slavery. But everybody knows what happened to Lincoln. He was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, who was a part of another xenophobic white nationalist group. That's what happened to him. Now we're going to read chapter 46, which is the last chapter before a few acknowledgments at the end. A plaintive wail starts with a quote signed by W.T. Sherman, Major General, from Savannah, Georgia, dated December 22nd, 1864. To His Excellency, President Lincoln, I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah with 150 heavy guns and plenty of ammunition, and also about 25,000 bales of cotton. From a formerly enslaved Civil War veteran named Albert Jones in Portsmouth, Virginia, written January 8th, 1937. When the war ended, I goes back to my master and he treated me like his brother. Guess he was scared of me because I had so much ammunition on me. Now the war could be won, as with the previous proclamations by Dunmore and the Sonthrax and the Palavrel, emancipation meant Black soldiers in combat, even as it emboldened many of the enslaved who heard about it throughout the South. Pursuant to the Emancipation Proclamation, 166 Black regiments were created. The number of African Americans who fought is officially around 180,000. But it seems like there were more than that. By war's end, about 10% of the U.S. Army was Black, though they were not commanded by Black officers. They were known to be dedicated fighters. For them, the war was even more dangerous than it was for white soldiers. In his previously quoted message, Jefferson Davis announced that his post-emancipation proclamation intent was to treat all captured Union soldiers as guilty of exciting servile insurrection, which is to say, to execute them. The Confederate hierarchy construed all Black soldiers to be guilty of that crime and deserving of death. From the first encounters between Black soldiers and Confederates in battle, pursuant to the Emancipation Proclamation, the Confederates waged Black flag or no quarter war. Atrocities were routine, taking no prisoners. They slaughtered wounded Black soldiers, on occasion bayoneting them repeatedly or beating their brains out with clubs. Confederate soldiers frequently made every effort to unalive Black soldiers on the battlefield, murdering them in cold blood if they were captured, including, writes Gregory J.W. Unwin, those who attempted to surrender and wounded men too weak to offer resistance. Captured Black soldiers who were not killed were frequently enslaved. Confederates also typically targeted for murder the white commanders of the Black regiments. The knowledge that any whites associated with Black troops would be flat out killed was intended to drive a wedge between the white and Black Union soldiers. Afraid of the consequences, the Union refrained from calling for no quarter war in reprisal, thereby leaving their Black troops to be sacrificed. You hear that? So they did not respond with an equal or greater force. They bowed down to this Southern aggression and left us to be slaughtered, but we still fought for our freedom. There were thus two different war regimes operating, one for white prisoners and the other, even more horrible, for Black prisoners. Confederate war crimes far exceeded those of the Federals by every measure, writes George S. Burkhart, who called attention to it in Confederate Rage and Yankee Wrath, his book. Confederate violence in battle was genocidal toward Black people, reaching a fever pitch comparable to the final moments of what the other major bloody American War of Abolition, the Haitian Revolution. The mere fact of a Black man in a military uniform with a weapon was cognitive dissonance. In the Confederate worldview, this was not possible. As they saw it, the enemy was less than human and was their own escaped property. In the words of a South Carolina woman, just think about how infamous it is that our gentlemen should have to go out and fight niggers, and that every nigger they shoot is $1,000 out of their own pockets. The most notorious massacre, though not the largest, was committed by the troops of Nathan Bedford Forrest at Fort Pillow, an army post of no great strategic importance, on a Tennessee bluff overlooking the Mississippi River on April 12th through 13th, 1864. Nathan Bedford Forrest had enlisted the Confederate Army as a private, but quickly became a lieutenant colonel, then one of the most celebrated Confederate generals. He was a cavalryman, said to be one of the best horsemen in the army, whose principal military technique was the aggressive assault. After charging into Fort Pillow, the troops under Forrest's command killed in cold blood perhaps as many as 500 Union soldiers who had surrendered there. There's no definitive count. Over a period of 2 days, most of them were Black. The New York Tribune reported that 5 soldiers were buried alive. Nathan Forrest's New York Times obituary in 1877 recalled the massacre, saying, without discrimination of age or sex, men, women, and children, the sick and the wounded in the hospitals were butchered without mercy. The bloody work went on until night put a temporary stop to it, but it was renewed at early dawn when the inhuman captors searched the vicinity of the fort, dragging out wounded fugitives and killing them where they lay. The whole history of the affair was brought out by the congressional inquiry and in testimony presented a long series of sickening, cold blooded atrocities. The news of the massacre aroused the whole country to a paroxysm of horror and fury. In an 1865 interview with Forrest, conducted by a reporter for the New Orleans True Delta and reprinted in other newspapers, he was asked if the investigators or the Yankees' report of Fort Pillow was accurate. He answered, yes, if we are to believe anything a nigger says. Then he added, when I went into the war, I meant to fight. Fighting means killing. I have lost 29 horses in the war, and I have killed a man each time. There were many witnesses to the Fort Pillow massacre, which contributed to its visibility as a media event. But Fort Pillow was not an anomaly. The level of hatred displayed toward Black soldiers was consistent wherever Confederates fought. A Virginia colonel described the wholesale slaughter of prisoners at the disastrous Battle of the Crater outside Petersburg, Virginia, in July of 1864, saying, our men, who were always made wild by having Negroes sent against them, were utterly frenzied with rage. Nothing in the war could have exceeded the horrors that followed. No quarter was given. For what seemed a long time, fearful butchery was carried on. Black troops made Remember Fort Pillow into a battle cry. You see that? Remember Fort Pillow. Remember what has happened to you. Remember that the Ma'afa is a crime and it is ongoing. It is the worst crime in human history and it is ongoing. They tell you to forget because that quells and quenches the fire of justice that burns inside of you. Black troops made Remember Fort Pillow into a battle cry and became increasingly disposed to give no quarter. Burkhart quotes a New Jersey officer saying, the rebel prisoners are very fearful of being left to colored troops as they fear their own acts of inhumanity will be repaid. Forrest troops continued their homicidal career in June, a little north of Tupelo, Mississippi, at Bryce's Crossroads, where Forrest scored his greatest victory of the war against an enemy superior in numbers. After routing a Union force of 8,000 under the incompetent direction of Brigadier General Samuel Sturgis, Forrest's men hunted down and killed members of Colonel Edward Bolton's colored brigade, who had survived the battle. In April of 1865, Forrest directed a massacre of Union troops near Selma while they were sleeping. Anthony McPhail says Nathan Bedford Forrest looked like he was straight out of hell. He was a demon. Yes, he was. The month after the Fort Pillow massacre, General William Tecumseh Sherman, who liked neither Black people nor abolitionists, began his Atlanta campaign, entering Georgia from Chattanooga on the north. He burned the strategic rail depot in Atlanta, a small town whose population had multiplied under the pressure of war. Some of Atlanta was torched by Sherman's troops, and some of the Confederate General John Bell Hood. About half the city went up in flames. It was tremendous news in the North. Sherman followed up Atlanta on November 15th with his 60-mile wide, 300-mile long march to the sea without supply lines, forcing his 62,000 troops to eat their way through the country as they tore up railroad tracks and burned industrial, governmental, and military facilities and cotton crops along the way. Sherman's march, tactically aimed at destroying what remained of the Southern railroad system and strategically aimed at stopping the war once and for all, has been traditionally portrayed in the South as an orgy of cruelty, acquiring a mythical reputation as Exhibit A of Northern aggression. But they don't talk about Forrest and what he did. Sherman's troops certainly caused suffering, in part because they destroyed food supplies as well as cotton, but they concentrated primarily on strategic targets rather than residences. Yes, some homes were burned, especially those of the planters. Sherman took special care to make sure that Howell Cobb's plantation was burned to the ground, but the property that Sherman troops fired was the least of the wealth they destroyed. They burned slavery to the ground. Whatever else Sherman's march symbolized for the enslaved, it was a march of liberation. As one of the war's best known songs, composed by Henry Clay Works, recalls, hurrah, hurrah, we bring the Jubilee. Hurrah, hurrah, the flag that makes us free. And so we sang the chorus from Atlanta to the sea while we were marching through to Georgia. Hurrah, hurrah, we're free. Marching through Georgia took in took its place alongside the most popular anthem played by Northern military bands, the string John Brown's Body, for which Julia Ward Howe had written new lyrics, still familiar today as the battle hymn of the Republic. Noah Andre Trudeau quotes a letter written during the campaign by General William P. Carlin of the 1st Division that described what happened on one occasion when the band played the song. Sang, about a dozen young African American girls came out of nearby houses, formed into a ring around the band at the head of the column, and with a weird, plaintive wail, they danced in a circle, a most solemn, dignified, and impressive manner, wrote Carlin years afterwards. What their meaning was, I did not know then, nor do I know now, but I, of course, interpreted it, of course, as expressive of goodwill to our cause. Carlin was hearing a ring shout, a collective song of spiritual power sung and danced in a moving counterclockwise circle. One of the oldest known forms of African American music, heavily Congo in influence, the ring shout is known in the Sea Islands as well as points west, all the way to Louisiana, Mississippi Delta region, where it became part of the Baptist tradition of rocks. Meanwhile, Jacob Thompson was plotting the mass murder of Northern civilians on behalf of the Confederacy. Funded with $1 million in gold and sent by Judah P. Benjamin to be head of the Confederate Secret Service operations in Canada, Thomas dispatched incendiary attacks on New York and Chicago. These terrorist acts were to be coordinated with occupation by the former Knights of the Golden Circle, as of 1864 called the Sons of Liberty, whose membership was said, perhaps hyperbolically, to number in the hundreds of thousands. The forecast says Lincoln told that guy Sherman to stop freeing slaves because he didn't want to piss off the slave owners. Exactly. Exactly. So Lincoln was no friend of the slave. He was a unionist. That never happened. But had Confederate Colonel Robert Martin been less inept in scouting locations and using his Greek fire phosphorus bombs, the plot for 8 infiltrated Confederate officers to burn down New York City in massive conflagration on November 25th, 1864, might well have succeeded, in which case the Confederacy would have exacted a civilian death toll of possibly historic proportions. What we as African people need to see and note here is that um, Americans don't necessarily get killed by foreigners. Americans get killed and unalived by Americans because these were Confederates that planned to take out civilians. So they didn't have any compunction or any, they didn't have any requirements against taking out civilians. The fires were set but in closed spaces where they burned out for lack of oxygen. The Confederate commander, General William D. Hardee, fled Savannah with 10,000 troops rather than confront Sherman, and he did not burn the town upon leaving, nor did the Savannans put up resistance. So the fine houses of Oglethorpe's Jewel City were spared the torch. Instead, Sherman established his headquarters there. A train of thousands of former slaves followed Sherman's troops to Savannah, creating a refugee problem. Not until Sherman's arrival in Savannah did the town's slave trade stop. Some traders escaped the city with captives, while others were less successful. And at least 2 traders, E.M. Blount and W.C. Dawson, fell victim to revolt. As the horrified trader Henry Bogardus wrote his sister, Blount's Negroes killed him, and Dawson is not much better. For the whites of Savannah, Sherman's occupation was defeat. But among the black Savannans, as the Reverend James Simmons recalled, the cry went around the city from house to house among our race of people, "Glory be to God, we are free." Almost immediately, the Black community of Savannah organized around the Savannah Education Association. The Montmolan building, previously a Savannah slave traders headquarters, was occupied by a school. It still had bars on the windows, and all they had to use for paper was the blank backside of stacks of bills of sales for slaves, which were thus lost to history, but at least some children learned how to read and write. Sherman then continued on to Charleston, which fell in February of 1865 after a siege of 545 days. Greetings, Sister Ra and the elders listening with you. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. Charleston had already suffered a devastating fire in December of 1861. Now, as most of the city's white population fled, Confederate troops set fire to the cotton in the warehouses and to the ships in the harbor and blew up their explosives, generating a great blaze that unalived at least 150 civilians before Union troops put it out. In the chaos, 2 Northern journalists broke into the hastily abandoned slave mart on Chalmers Street. Charles Carlton Coffin, who reported for the Boston Journal, took the gilt letters that read Mart as a souvenir. James Redpath of the New York Tribune, who had previously announced that he was not only an abolitionist, but a reparationist, scooped up 652 letters to slave trader Ziba B. Oaks from his regional purchasing agent, which he donated to William Lloyd Garrison, and which since 1891 have been in the Boston Public Library. The people of Richmond had become accustomed to the sound of artillery fire, but now they too had to flee Grant's army. "My line is broken in 3 places and Richmond must be evacuated," wrote Robert E. Lee to Confederate President Jefferson Davis, who ordered the evacuation of the Confederate capital on April 2nd, 1865. As Davis ran with the members of his government on board to board the Danville train, Robert Lumpkin hurried amid the chaos to evacuate the captives from his slave jail, setting out with one final coffle. The classic account of the fall of Richmond is in Coffin's report. Mrs. Davis had left the city several days prior. There was no evening service. Ministers and congregations were otherwise employed. Reverend Hogue, a fierce advocate for slavery as a beneficent institution, packed his carpet bag. Reverend Mr. Duncan was moved to do likewise. Mr. Lumpkin, who for many years had kept the slave traders' jail, had a work of necessity on this Lord's Day. The temporal salvation of 50 men, women, and children. He made up his coffle in the jail yard within pistol shot of Jeff Davis's parlor window and a stone's throw away from the monumental church. The poor creatures were hurried to the Danville depot. This sad and weeping 50 in handcuffs and chains was the last coffle that shall tread the soil of America. It wasn't. There were still coffles, but the Union had not entered Texas. Slavery being the cornerstone of the Confederacy, it was fitting that this gang, keeping step to the music of their clanking chains, should accompany Jeff Davis, his secretaries Benjamin and Trenholm, and the Reverend Monsignors Hodge and Duncan in their flight. The whole rebel government was on the move, and all of Richmond desired to be. No thoughts now of taking Washington or the flag of the Confederacy flaunting in the breeze from the dome of the nation's capital. Hundreds of officials were at the depot waiting to get away from the doomed city. Public documents, the archives of the Confederacy, were hastily gathered up, tumbled into boxes and barrels, and taken to the trains or carried into the streets and set on fire. Coaches, carriages, wagons, carts, wheelbarrows, and everything in the shape of a vehicle was pressed into use. There was a jumble of boxes, chests, trunks, valises, carpet bags, a crowd of excited men sweating as never before, women with disheveled hair, unmindful of their wardrobes, wringing their hands, children crying out in the crowd, sentinels guarding each entrance to the train, pushing back at the point of a bayonet the panic-stricken multitude, giving precedence to Davis and the high officials, informing Mr. Lumpkin that his niggers could not be taken. The forecast says he is surprised that he didn't mention the Ebenezer Creek massacre. The Union did that to Black people. He also says Lumpkin's jail used to send rebellious slaves there to be broken. The building, Lumpkin's jail, is still there to this very day. Greetings, KW Don 7. Thanks so much for tuning in. We're finishing up The American Slave Coast, A History of Slave Breeding. We're on chapter 47 and 46, and we are on page 652. Oh, what a loss was there It would have been $50,000 out of somebody's pocket in 1861 and millions now of Confederate promises to pay, which the hurrying multitude and that chained slave gang were treading underfoot, trampling the bonds of the Confederate States of America in the mire as they marched to the station. For the oozy streets were as thickly strewn with 4%, 6%, 8% as forest streams of autumn's leaves. The faith of the Confederate States is pledged to provide and establish sufficient revenues for the regular payment of interest and for the redemption of the principal, read the bonds. But there was a sudden eclipse of faith, a collapse of confidence, a shriveling up like a parched scroll of the entire Confederacy, which was a base counterfeit the American Union sought to overrun and supplant, now an exploded concern and wound up by Grant's orders, its bonds, notes, and certificates of indebtedness worth less than the paper on which they were printed. Jefferson Davis was trying to get to Texas to continue the war from there. Did Lumpkin think he was taking his coffle to Texas too? There was nowhere to take a coffle. Those 50 people weren't going to be anyone's property now. In a dramatic show of defiance, the Confederate General Richard S. Ewell torched a large area of Richmond, definitively ruining many of the city's businessmen, because again, they will destroy themselves just so that you don't have it. It was done with the acquiescence of his superior, Confederate Secretary of War, John C. Breckinridge, who was present and in the city. Richmond's Whig report on April 4th, 1865, seemed to suggest that the city had been ridded of an occupier with the departure of the Confederate government, which had been its capital, an occupier that destroyed much of Richmond as it fled. It read, by noon, the flames had transformed into a desert waste that portion of the city bounded between 7th and 15th Streets. From Main Street to the river, comprising the main business portion. We can form no estimate at this moment the number of houses destroyed, but public and private, they will certainly number 600 to 800. At present, we cannot do more than enumerate some of the most prominent buildings destroyed. These include the Bank of Richmond, Traders Bank, Bank of the Commonwealth, Bank of Virginia, Farmers Bank, all the banking houses, the American Hotel, the Columbian Hotel, the Inquirer Building on 12th Street, the Dispatch Office and Jobs Rooms, corner of 13th and Main Streets, all that block of buildings known as Belvin's Block, the Examiner Office, Engine and Machinery Rooms, the Confederate Post Office Department Building, the State Courthouse, a fine old building situated on Capitol Square at its Franklin Street entrance, the Mechanics Institute, vacated by the Confederate States War Department, and all the buildings on that square up to 8th Street and back to Main Street, the Confederate Arsenal and Laboratory on 7th Street, and the laboratory on 7th Street. At sunrise on Monday morning, Richmond presented a spectacle that we hope to never witness again. The last of the Confederate officials had gone. The air was lurid with smoke and flame of hundreds of houses sweltering in a sea of fire. Coffin reported that to prevent the United States from obtaining possession of a few thousand hogs' heads of tobacco. 1,000 houses were destroyed by fire. The heart of the city burnt out. All of the business portion, all the banks and insurance offices, half of the newspapers with mills, depots, bridges, foundries, workshops, dwellings, churches, 30 squares in all, were swept clean by the devouring flames. It was the final work of the Confederate government. Richmond's slave trade had continued full tilt with a large population in the traders' jails when the Union entered the city. Chaplain Garland White, an African American soldier who entered Richmond with Indiana's 28th Regiment, described his experience in a letter written shortly after leaving the city, saying, "A vast multitude assembled on Broad Street, and I was aroused amid the shouts of 10,000 voices, and proclaimed for the first time in that city freedom to all mankind. After which the doors of all the slave pens were thrown open, and thousands came out shouting and praising God and Father and Master Abe, as they termed him." On April 4th, Elizabeth Keckley visited Richmond. As she accompanied Mary Todd Lincoln on the steamer River Queen up the James. The river was so long that it had been impassable even to our gunboats. To join the presidential party with Lincoln at the head to examine the city's condition. The presidential party were all curiosity on entering Richmond. They drove about the streets of the city and examined every object of interest. The Capitol presented a desolate appearance, desks broken and papers scattered promiscuously in the hurried flight of the Confederate Congress. I picked up a number of papers, and by curious coincidence, the resolution prohibiting all free people of color from entering the state of Virginia. In the Senate chamber, I sat in the chair that Jefferson Davis sometimes occupied, also in the chair that Vice President Alexander H. Stephens sat in. We paid a visit to the mansion occupied by Mr. Davis and the family during the war, and the ladies who were in charge of it scowled darkly upon our party as we passed through and inspected the different rooms. After a delightful visit, we returned to Point City. 5 days after Lee's surrender to Grant on Good Friday, April the 14th, Lincoln became the first president in history to be assassinated. John Wilkes Booth's conspiracy also gravely wounded Secretary of State William Seward and members of his family, and unsuccessfully targeted Vice President Andrew Johnson of Tennessee, who had been drunk at his swearing in as vice president not 6 weeks previously, on March 4th, 1865. Booth was killed during capture before he could be questioned. 8 people were convicted and executed for participating in his conspiracy. Jacob Thompson spent the rest of his life trying to clear his name of a rumored involvement in it. Was there a conspiracy involving Thompson's terrorist organization or other elements of the Confederate hierarchy? None has been proved, and Booth has often been portrayed as a fanatic in popular historiography. But that's too simple. Writing of the monk who assassinated the French King Henry III, the historian Geoffrey Treasure called him not mad, but exalted, a recognizable type, not an isolated individual, but representative, doing what many wished to see done. Now, if Calhoun, Rhett, Davis, Stevens, Cobb, Forrest, and their many leagues of colleagues were not madmen, neither was Booth. And if they were madmen, at what point did this madness end? At Forrest's wholesale butchery, at Rhett's bizarre pain to martyrdom, at Calhoun's insistence that slavery was a positive good for humanity, at Jackson's genocide and ethnic cleansing, or would it be at Jefferson's scheme to deport all Black people? The madness was there all along. It was the madness of slavery. In the Civil War's final battle of Mississippi for Columbus, Georgia on April 16, 1865, the forces of Union General John H. Wilson, who had not received word of Lincoln's assassination 2 nights before, defeated those of former U.S. Secretary of State, now Confederate Major General Howell Hobb. On May 2nd, President Johnson signed the proclamation offering $100,000 for the arrest of Jefferson Davis in connection with Lincoln's assassination, and a manhunt for Davis ensued. Whatever the conspiratorial mechanism, Lincoln's assassination was a coup d'etat that carried a number of benefits for the former Confederates who might reasonably have expected to hang for treason. Johnson was a pro-Union white supremacist who was uninterested in prosecuting Confederate leaders or in helping freed men. He issued presidential amnesties and pardons for former Confederates and restored confiscated lands, thus ensuring that there would be no 40 acres and a mule, as Rufus Saxton of the Freedmen's Bureau had been promised, to compensate the destitute, largely illiterate mass of the formerly enslaved for their multi-generational legacy of confiscated labor. There were no war crimes trials for the mass murder of Black troops under cover of battle. But the fundamental change had been made. The Southern economy had suffered its final fatal collapse, the one long feared by slave owners. Their property had ceased to be property. They were not compensated by the taxpayers for its loss, as Jamaican slave owners had been. No more counting children as interests. No more multi-generational wealth accumulating from the reproduction of enslaved humans to be passed on as legacies to slave owners' children. No more paying debts in a bad year by cashing out and selling adolescents. The liquidity of the financial system vanished when ownership of the human capital was transferred from landowners to the laborers themselves. No more forced mating, no more fancy girls, no more sex slaves. The Ponzi scheme of the slave breeding industry had crashed. Since laborers were no longer property, they were no longer mortgageable. Without enslaved women producing ever-increasing numbers of slave children to borrow against, the South suffered a massive credit implosion, whiplashing from a credit economy to a cash-poor cash economy, floating on a sea of bad debt. Many proud families never forgot the humiliation of losing their slaves, and some were downright hateful about it. Some former masters found it demeaning to share a sidewalk with Black people who did not jump out of the way. Others were surprised to find that they could no longer slap Black workers with impunity. There were still Black laborers, of course, but they were no longer work sun up. They would no longer work sun up to sundown to make ever increasing whip enforced quota for bacon and corn mush in return. Some of these planters decamped for Brazil, where they still are to this very day celebrating their Confederate traditions, which had slavery and plenty of land, and others for Mexico. A Confederate diaspora fanned northward up to Canada and out to the far west. The poor whites of the South had a miserable time of it in the economically devastating post war years. As the Southern states rejoined the country they had repudiated, many formerly wealthy Southerners occupied themselves by suing each other over old debts for which the collateral had vanished. But others have found ways to keep their money or even made money during the war. They could no longer live off human capital as rentiers, but the elite were still the elite, and elite families have remarkable staying power over multiple generations in every society. Since the planters' estates weren't broken up and distributed to the freedmen, they still had their land, which will be the basis of new fortunes. They still had their education, their family webs, their control of local institutions, their businesses, and their political contacts. They still had cheap black labor, which they kept as abject as possible by terrorizing them with a new racist regime that would come to be known as Jim Crow, enforced all over the former slave nation. Actually, it was all over the nation, period, and it was Jim Crow and the Ku Klux Klan. Many of the formerly enslaved, whose dispossession was so complete that they had not even family names, got little more out of Reconstruction than an assigned surname, which was the bare minimum necessary for the creation of a civil identity. Their new Anglo Saxon names were in many cases just assigned to them: Williams, Johnson, Smith, Jones, Brown, Jackson, Jefferson, Washington. Some of the elite who had the resources relocated with style, the so called Confederate carpetbaggers. They relocated to New York, Chicago, and other urban centers. Some renewed Northern commercial contracts or business partnerships that had been active before or even during the war and found that little stigma was attached to their former treasonous activities, which were now recast as Southern patriotism. Southern gynecologist Marion Sims, who had developed his surgical innovations by practicing on enslaved women without anesthesia, went to Europe during the war, where he operated on women of social importance for high fees. He's known as the father of modern gynecology. He was a monster. Returning to America, he established a private practice on Fifth Avenue and presented himself as a popular vision of a fabulously wealthy doctor celebrity. He was instrumental in founding the nation's first cancer hospital, Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, though he died a year before the project came to fruition in 1884. Isidor Straus, the Jew, spent much of the war in Europe, returning to America at war's end with about $10,000 in gold he had made in London trading Confederate bonds. His father, Lazarus Strauss, relocated the family's retailing firm from Columbus, Georgia to New York, where he became the owners of R. H. Macy's department store, then bought an interest in the store that became Abraham and Straus. Isidor Straus died in the 1912 sinking of the Titanic together with his wife Ida. Emanuel Lehman, already based in New York, also made money during the war selling Confederate bonds to England, at one point uncomfortably encountering his New York neighbor, Joseph Siegelman, who was selling Union bonds. After the war, Lehman Brothers put up about $100,000 for Alabama's Constitutional Convention. Meyer Lehman moved up to New York, where he organized the first futures market in cotton. Two of his former slaves came to New York to work for him as servants. The brothers parlayed their warehouses full of cotton into businesses that continued through many transformations until the panic of 2008, when Lehman Brothers filed for the largest bankruptcy in American history, intensifying a worldwide economic crisis. Widely suspected of being a planner of the Lincoln assassination, Judah P. Benjamin fled to London and became a barrister there. He wrote the standard legal work on the sale of personal property, became legal counsel to Queen Victoria, and died, quite wealthy, in Paris of 1884. Adelcia Hayes Franklin Ackland Cheatham, one of the wealthiest women in the United States, died at the age of 70 in 1887 in New York's Fifth Avenue Hotel of pneumonia contracted while on a shopping trip. J.D.B. Du Bois, who in the South had been the most influential pro-slavery publisher, started his Du Bois Review right back up in New York in 1866, but died the following year. Howell Cobb's plantation was up and running again soon after the war. According to Cobb, the problem was that the formerly enslaved laborers were ungrateful, as per a letter dated December 1866, where he said, "The truth is, I am thoroughly disgusted with free Negro labor, and am determined that the next year shall close my planting operation with them. There is no feeling of gratitude in their nature." Cobb, who was as guilty of treason as anyone in the Confederate project, received a presidential pardon and died of a heart attack in New York City in 1868. His son continued the plantation. Pierce Meese Butler's Georgia plantation survived the war intact. The places had been occupied by the Union earliest. Louisiana, the Sea Islands, Alexandria, etc., suffered less destruction, and the Union had occupied Butler's land from early in 1862, which likely saved it. Since the plantation was not broken up and distributed to the former slaves, Butler remained the owner. Though there was no longer slave labor, many of his former slaves returned to the plantation, presumably less because they loved the Butlers than because the plantation was their home and was the ancestral home of their close-knit community, or perhaps, as in other cases involving slaves who returned to the plantations they knew, because they were starving. Without a doubt, they would have preferred a small plot of land of their own in what sociologist Jean Casimir calls, speaking of Haiti, has called the counter-plantation system, a refusal of the plantation system itself involving the creation of a very different way of living, one focused on production for oneself and for surplus within a local market. But that was not the offer. Frances Kimball finally published her Journal of Life on Butler's Plantation as a book in 1863 in post-Emancipation Proclamation wartime. It became popular reading for abolitionists and caused a sharp rift with her pro Confederate younger daughter, Fan. After Pierce Meese Butler died of the archetypal low country disease malaria in 1867, Fan took the plantation over and tried to make it produce, but she couldn't make a go of it, blaming the labor force's disinclination to work as hard as necessary. So she failed at being a planter, and she blamed the black formerly enslaved people for not wanting to work as hard for her. Jefferson Davis never surrendered. As long as Robert E. Lee continued, the war went on. But even after Lee surrendered on April 9th, Davis did not. He was captured on May 10th in Virginia while trying to escape to Texas and was imprisoned for 10 years. He never asked for a pardon. He never apologized. He never swore allegiance to the United States, failed at his business initiatives, and spent much time being a traveling guest of honor until he died in a mansion in New Orleans Garden District in 1889. In 1881, he published a stultifying 1,515-page The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government, in which he insisted that, to whatever extent the question of slavery may have been served as an occasion, it was far from being the cause of the conflict. The cause, he explained, was sectional rivalry and political ambition that happened to have coincided along the line of demarcation of slavery versus free labor. He also maintained that African servitude among us was the mildest and most humane of all institutions to which the name slavery has ever been applied. I want you to know that there are always two sides of the story, and that these books that are pro slavery, pro Confederacy actually exist, and that they wrote literature to support their ideology, and that if they had won, that would be the pop culture literature of the day, and that that is the literature that is floating throughout the South, that is circulating among these poor white people households, just so you know. Robert Lumpkin barely outlived the war. He died in 1866 at the age of 60. His livelihood of slave trading destroyed. But shortly before he died, he named his former slave, Mary, executor of his estate, and granted her the right to use his name Lumpkin, provided she did not remarry. She became the sole proprietor of his properties in Richmond and in Philadelphia. Mary Lumpkin thus became the owner of the property she had lived on since she was 12, formerly known as Lumpkin's Jail. It had been famous to every trader in Virginia and notorious to the thousands of African Americans who had passed through it. It was nearly worthless. Desperate, like everyone else, for income in the charred ruin of Richmond, she rented it for $1,000 a year to Reverend Nathaniel Culver, a Boston minister, to be used as the school for the former slaves, subsequently becoming Virginia Union University. White landlords wouldn't rent their property out for such a purpose, so the newly freed students had to go down to the muddy embankment at the Shopko bottom. Unfortunately, Mary also inherited Lumpkin's debts, and she died poor. Lumpkin's competitor, Silas Almohandro, whose slave jailer joined his, had done something very similar before he died in 1864, leaving the use of his properties in Richmond and Pennsylvania to his formerly enslaved common law wife, Karina, with whom he had 6 children. Karina fared better than Mary Lumpkin. She came to own her own confectionery. Lewis Hughes did not escape from slavery in Mississippi until 1865. He went behind Union lines and from there managed to rescue his wife and children. After moving around, the family settled in Milwaukee, where he worked as a nurse, and where in 1897 he published his autobiography, 30 Years a Slave. Frederick Douglass's house in Rochester, New York, was burned down in 1872, apparently an arson. From late 1889 to mid 1891, he served as the U.S. Minister to Haiti. He died of heart failure in 1895 at the approximate age of 87. Though he was the leading African American literary and political figure of the 19th century, his writing was largely forgotten until rediscovery began in 1845 when historian Philip Foner edited a multi-volume anthology of his work. William Wells Brown devoted his post-emancipation years to activism on behalf of the temperance cause and practiced medicine in Boston, specializing in homeopathy. On the occasion of his return to his birth state of Kentucky, he was kidnapped by the Ku Klux Klan but escaped. He died at the age of 70 in Massachusetts. After Harriet Jacobs escaped from Endenton, North Carolina to Philadelphia with the help of a boat captain in 1842, she lived in fear of being captured again, especially after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law. She became well known in abolitionist circles with her self publication in 1861, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, which came back from the printer shortly after the first wave of the Southern states seceded. A vocal advocate of an Emancipation Proclamation, with great dignity, she organized relief for the contrabands, the homeless, impoverished refugees whose slavery poured into Washington and other cities in the early days of the war. With the post Emancipation Proclamation entry of Black soldiers into the war, Jacobs was active in aiding convalescent soldiers in Washington. And together with her daughter, she founded a free school after the war. She was largely forgotten after her death and had been rediscovered. Jean Fagan Yellen's biography of her, from which we extract the above information, was published in 2004. Indeed, Jacob's memoir was considered by many critics to be a fiction until Yellen authenticated it in 1987. Elizabeth Keckley founded the Contraband Relief Organization in 1862, attempted to raise money for Mary Todd Lincoln, and published her book in 1868. She died in poverty in 1907, a resident of the National Home for Destitute Colored Women and Children in Washington, for which she had helped raise founding funds. General Sherman went on to supervise the building of the Transcontinental Railroad during the Grant administration, which meant completing the killing of the buffalo herds, and that Sherman referred to in a letter as the final solution to the Indian problem, in which the West Native Americans were slaughtered or moved onto reservations, the Trail of Tears. If anyone in the Confederate ranks might have seemed to be a candidate for hanging, it would have been Nathan Bedford Forrest. By the time he was pardoned by Andrew Jackson instead of being tried as a war criminal, he had already returned to violence. Not 2 years after the Fort Pillow massacre in the fall of 1866, he was sworn in at Maxwell House in Nashville as the Grand Wizard of the Invisible Empire of the Ku Klux Klan, beginning as a posse of malicious night-riding pranksters complete with a fanciful carnivalesque pedigree that cast them as Scottish knights. The Klan quickly expanded into other states and became the nation's most notorious, though not only white supremacist paramilitary organization, as Bedford prosecuted a race war. In what was arguably the largest terrorist campaign in U.S. history, the Klan and similar organizations murdered thousands of Black people and white people as part of a successful effort to repress Reconstruction and Black self determination. President Ulysses S. Grant, inaugurated in 1869, believed that the sacrifice of so much blood in the war had to be redeemed by fully enfranchising the formerly enslaved. That was precisely the proposition the Ku Klux Klan was determined to reverse. But after Grant made clear his determination to prosecute the Klan, Forrest officially disbanded it in February of 1869. By then, much of their work had already been done. In subsequent testimony before Congress, Forrest added perjury to his list of crimes by denying his involvement with the Klan. With no more slave trading business to do, Forrest ventured his net worth on a proposed Memphis and Selma Railroad, which was never built. As his railroad plan deflated, Forrest, thinking there might be war with Spain and that it might take place in Cuba where slavery still existed, though it was now fading, offered his services to, of all people, General Sherman, as reported in the New York Times, dated December 3rd, 1873. I hereby tender you my services as a volunteer. I think I could enlist from 1,000 to 5,000 men who served in the Southern Army during the late war and at a short notice, and who could rendezvous at New Orleans, Mobile, Pensacola, and Key West, either as cavalry or infantry. Sherman politely explained that he did not believe there would be a war with Spain and Cuba. Ultimately, there was one, but it happened 25 years later. Forrest spent the rest of his life trying to live down Fort Pillow, for which his name was popularly held in contempt. Though in the South, there was no lack of apologists for him. In the perhaps sarcastic words of his New York Times obituary dated October 30th, 1877, his last notable public appearance was on the 4th of July in Memphis, where he appeared before the colored people at their celebration, was publicly presented with a bouquet by them as a mark of peace and reconciliation, and made a friendly speech in reply. In this, he once more took occasion to defend himself and his war record, and to declare that he was a hearty friend of the colored race. That's appalling. Slave trader and war criminal, the KKK's top terrorist, if Nathan Bedford Forrest's reputation could be sanitized, anyone could be. A high school named for Forrest exists in his hometown of Chapel Hill, Tennessee. Another in Jacksonville changed its name in 2014. Forrest's final business venture was a plantation that used captive labor under the postbellum name of convict leasing. He contracted it in 1875 with Shelby Council Jail to put 117 prisoners, 39 of whom were white, to work for a term of 5 years, though he died in 1877, paying the jail 10 cents a day for their otherwise uncompensated labor, employing 7 guards to watch over them. The slaves of the South had been emancipated by then, of course, but the 13th Amendment, adopted on December 18th, 1865, to prohibit slavery, left a loophole: prisons. It reads in its entirety: neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime, whereof the parties shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. You got to remember, they say involuntary servitude. You can volunteer to be a slave. That's what you do with your job every day. But they just pay you. You're an urban slave. It has been argued that the framers of the 13th Amendment did not intend to tolerate slavery, and that the phrase, except as punishment for a crime, should be parsed only modifying involuntary servitude and not slavery. A clearer version had been proposed. Slavery, being incompatible with a free government, is forever prohibited in the United States, and involuntary servitude shall be permitted only as punishment for a crime. But it was Thomas Jefferson's phrasing and vision that prevailed. The amendment's framers copied the more ambiguous language of the Northern Ordinance of 1787, which in turn had taken it from Jefferson's draft of the Land Ordinance of 1784 after the year 1800 in the Christian era. There shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in any of the said states, otherwise than in punishment of crimes whereof the party shall have been convicted to have been duly personally guilty. From Jefferson's ambiguity forward, convict labor has been a part of American commerce, and as 21st century readers, we are well aware that it continues. And finally, the last 2 pages, the coda, which starts with a quote from Martin Luther King's speech, Three Evils, dated August 31st, 1967. Again, we have deluded ourselves into believing the myth that capitalism grew and prospered out of the Protestant ethic of hard work and sacrifice. The fact is that capitalism was built on the exploitation and suffering of Black slaves and continues to thrive on the exploitation of the poor, both Black and white, both here and abroad. If anyone reading this book in the future wants to know the American historical context in which it was composed, the drafting was finished in August of 2014 while the national trauma of Ferguson was going on, and the finishing touches were made during the aftermath of the Charleston massacre of June 2015. Today, people are no longer sold like livestock in the public market. But the racism slavery engendered has been resilient, having become a seemingly systematic disfigurement of American society. The post-emancipation history is a gloomy one. The only group that has been brought to America against their will is still on the bottom. After a brief period of Reconstruction that saw much progress, including the establishment of Black colleges, the freedmen were abandoned by the North to the mercy of Southern sheriffs by the time the Hayes-Tilden Compromise of 1877. Their rights and possibilities were severely limited by ever more discriminatory Black codes that locked white supremacy into place. While they were no longer legally treated as chattel, African Americans have systematically been excluded from educational, professional, and housing opportunities, have been frequently denied the possibility of relocating, were sometimes forced into labor, and were generally the victims of a nearly century-long post-war campaign of domestic terrorism. They have suffered through peonage, debt servitude, sharecropping, and a sustained campaign of lynching. The golden age of the American economy following the Second World War, in which the working class did better relative to the wealthy than at any other time in American history, pointedly excluded Black people. African Americans' collective struggle took until the 1960s to result in full legal rights. The enforcement of Brown versus the Board of Education, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Housing Rights Act of 1968. The counter revolution to this second Reconstruction was immediate. Now, they are framing this as though we got rights and were treated and respected with equality because of these pieces of the words on these pieces of paper, when in fact we were not. We still had to get we still had to fight our way to freedom. We still had to enforce the law because it was of no effect if they weren't willing to uphold the law. The last school was desegregated in the 90s. But anyway, the counter revolution to this second Reconstruction was immediate. African Americans were further ghettoized. Black neighborhoods around the country were lacerated and even destroyed by the Eisenhower Interstate Highway System, whose construction began in 1956. The interstate rammed elevated highways through the poorer parts of many cities, demolishing Black business districts and isolating existing housing projects in cul-de-sacs, while Black applicants were denied mortgages in the suburbs that the new highway facilitated. African Americans ended up clustered in the old city cores that the whites had abandoned, with their children attending dilapidated, underfunded, Black only schools. Beginning in 1971, with President Richard Nixon's war on drugs, along with three strikes laws and other mandatory sentencing guidelines, and a plea bargaining system that made jury trials practically a thing of the past, the U.S. prison population exploded in size, including millions of nonviolent drug offenders. As we write this book in 2014, 2015, the United States has for some years been the world's number one incarcerator by far, holding at present, according to the most commonly cited figure, around 25% of the world's prisoners. In what has come to be known as the cradle to prison pipeline, Black men are incarcerated at about 6 times the rate relative to the population of white men, and Black women at about double the rate of white women. Black women at about double the rate of white women. The prison population is heavily skewed toward the South, 10, which means they are still operating on a 3/5 clause because they get representation based on population, right? But that population can't vote. So, in a state that has a prison population of, let's say, 500,000 people, that state gets a boom in Congress for seats, but those 500,000 people who are incarcerated don't have the right to vote. 10 of the top 11 American incarcerators are former slave states, with Louisiana being number 1 and Mississippi being number 2. Private for-profit prisons began in 1984, with their growth stimulated by a 1995 model Prison Industries Act, introduced into state legislatures around the country in an organized campaign by the right-wing American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC. Convicted felons have a hard time getting a job, and since felons are disenfranchised in many states, Black people have been disproportionately removed from the voting rolls. The forecast says we still do today. They claim schools are integrated, but are they really? Schools are not actually integrated. Schools are integrated on paper. There's no law that says you can't go to that school, but if you don't live in that neighborhood and that's a predominantly white neighborhood, then you don't get to go to that school and you don't gain access to those resources. And then you go through the question of, do you really want to send your baby to a predominantly white school to be terrorized by these white people who are going to want to touch their hair and touch their skin and try to throw bleach on them and do horrible things? We've had too many babies that have committed suicide because their parents put them in a predominantly white environment and they were not prepared to go into that environment and they killed themselves. Anyway, last hired, first fired, increased post civil rights economic and professional opportunities were countered by a redistribution to the wealthy that picked up steam in the post Reagan era. Education and medical care have been repriced out of the reach of the poor and increasingly require legal sophistication to navigate. The new inequality hit the long-term disadvantage the hardest, a tendency that accelerated drastically in the post-Bush versus Gore years. The financial crisis that began in the late 2007 wiped out any gains that had been made by many African Americans, especially those targeted by predatory lending. Plunder in the past made plunder in the present efficient, writes Ta-Nehisi Coates, referring to the 21st century subprime mortgage crisis that disproportionately affected Black homeowners. Meanwhile, police brutality and murder, a long-standing problem, has emerged as a national issue in the age of video documentation. When it is no longer possible to pretend it doesn't happen, while open carry and other firearm laws favor increased aggression by white supremacist hate groups whose numbers skyrocketed during the Obama presidency. To be sure, society does not necessarily look the way it did when the Civil War centennial began in 1961. Some African Americans occupy high professional and political positions. We got Black faces in high places. But the economic gap between Black and white has not been bridged. Black unemployment remains more than double that of whites in the 50 years from 1963 to 2013, with African Americans earning on average two-thirds as much. 27.6% of African American households were in poverty in 2013, compared to 9.8% for whites. Multi-generational wealth and multi-generational poverty seem to be nearly intractable forces, especially under the protection of a government by the wealthy for the wealthy. In talking about this book in progress with your friends and strangers, we have frequently heard people say, but slavery is still going on today. The highly charged S word, sometimes used metaphorically, sometimes not, is a broad term that can take on many different kinds of inhumane practices. Scholars today speak of slaveries. Our brief in writing this book was not to extend the covering of the postbellum forms of unfree labor, some legal and some not, which have been amply documented elsewhere. The postbellum neo-slavery of convict leasing that made Birmingham, Alabama a steel capital and continued in the South until the Second World War, the prison industrial complex of the modern mass incarceration state, contemporary migrant exploitation, sex trafficking, and other forms of coerced labor, sweatshop and agricultural labor, and present day work of all kinds performed in an environment of social brutality and under surveillance that persist In describing these as slavery is perhaps a measure of continuing weight of antebellum slavery and its burdensome shifting and shaping influence on our consciousness and our society, for which there have been adequate reparations, for which there have never been adequate reparations. Over the years, we have been researching our nation's history. We have seen repeatedly that no matter how bad we thought slavery was, it was even worse. There's no end to it. No matter how bad we thought it was, even in our vainest imagination, it was worse. There's no end to it. No one living today can fully understand what the enslaved endured in the total slavery world of the Old South, where the economy was dependent on the production of chattel laborers by female reproduction workers who could be forcibly impregnated for that purpose, with their sexual violation approved by law. Unfortunately, the agenda of the slave society seems all too familiar to us in the 21st century world. Antebellum slavery required a complex of social, legal, financial, and political institutions structured to maximize profits that flowed only to a small elite while leaving the rest of the population poor. It wanted no legal oversight beyond the local, no public education, and no dissent. Seems like they want that to this very day. It wanted, for laborers, it wanted no personhood, no wages, no education, no privacy, no clothing, no human rights, no civic identity, no civil responsibility, no reproductive rights, no right to keep, say, and have a stable family. It existed at the cost of everything else in the society, including the most basic notions of humanity. The history of slave breeding industry demonstrates how far the unrestrained pursuit of profit can go. And finally, after however many months it has been, we are done with this book. This book highlighted things that we already knew all in one place. It highlights the fact that none of these people are our friends. It highlights the fact that there were homosexuals in government that were working against Black people. It highlights the fact that there were white bitches in positions of power inheriting enslaved people that only wanted to enrich themselves. It highlights the fact that although these slave traders were traders, that they still had common law wifery, saw their enslaved property as their common law wife. I own you. This book highlighted a lot of stuff. What we need to know as African people is that we have no friends globally or socially. We need to know that if we are not looking into the eyes, hearts, mind, and soul of an African person with an African centered consciousness, we can move on. We need to know that Jewish people enslaved us and profited heavily off of our enslavement, so much so that white people were like, we want to get all the Jews out of the territory because they're making the situation worse. They're profiting off of this situation. We need to know that all of these systems that existed to facilitate our enslavement are still ongoing to this very day. So, as African people, what we need to know is that the Ma'afa is the greatest crime in human history and is ongoing. And if we can acknowledge that and tell ourselves the story of the Ma'afa and tell our children that they bred us like animals, that they fed us corn and mush like like we were like we were hogs, that they didn't clothe us, that they spit on us, that they put despicable things in our food, that they molested us sexually, male and female, boy and girl, that they bought us specifically for their sexual gratification, male and female, boy and girl. Excuse me, I needed a drink of water. That there is no equity in a relationship with a non-black or non-African person. I don't care what they tell you. The power dynamic is such in a white hegemonic society that there cannot be any equity in that relationship, because you can at best be their pet whom they love and take care of and feed and or have relations with. You can at best be their pet, but you can never be their equal in a nation that wants to be a white nationalist nation, or in a white hegemonic white supremacist society. I'm just saying. All right, guys, that is it. It is 11:15. If you don't mind, do me a favor. I'm trying something new on another channel because I don't want to bring all my spookisms to you guys and all my thoughts and identity about re-Africanizing the mind, but I do want your feedback. So if you don't mind, click on the link that I put in my community tab and listen to those African-centered affirmations and let me know what you think. All right. Thank you so much, Sister Raw, KW Don 7, The Forecast, and Anthony McPhail. Thank you all for being here. I know MG2 is listening. I know Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast is listening. I know Bawana Haguziki is listening. I know Real Black Gentleman is listening. I know that Oni Tase from the Pro Black Perspective is listening, and so many others, and you. Yes, you, dear listener, you are in fact listening, and I appreciate you for listening. I value each and every one of you. I will be back. We're going to start a different book next Tuesday. I will be back, and we will go forward and move on from here. Thank you so much for tuning in. Remember to tune in to all the shows on the KWAZ Radio Podcast Network, which include the Bitter Medicine Podcast, the Forecast Radio, the Cassidra Cheek Show, the Black Business Network, and the Pro Black Perspective, as well as the Harsh Reality Podcast and the Kofi the Black Critic. Thanks so much for tuning in. Peace, guys.